And we're on.
Welcome back to Trad Answers. I'm John Salza with Robert Sisko, and today we're going to be addressing an interesting document, Cum Ex Apostolatus. We read in the comments section a number of people wanting us to address this specifically in the context of universal and peaceful acceptance, which was the topic of our last podcast. So how are those to be reconciled? There are many out there in the Sedevacantist camp that say UPA is overruled by Cum Ex, and we're going to get into that issue today. So this was a document that was issued by Pope Paul IV in 1559, Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio, and it actually is a bull, a legislative bull, where the Pope was enacting a number of criteria to ensure the legitimate election of a Roman pontiff. And those who have used this document point to a particular section in Cum Ex, and it's interesting, Rob, that the heretics of our day are using this document just as the heretics of yesteryear used it as well. For example, the heretics around the First Vatican Council, who then became the old Catholics, used this very document. They unearthed this document, which was forgotten about by, for 3 centuries, to battle against the definition of papal infallibility. So that's another topic, but we find it interesting that the enemies of the church are using this very same document today. And so what they point to is a section in Cum Ex, which says, and I'm quoting in part, quote, and it's talking about the papal election, or even the Roman pontiff, prior to his promotion or his elevation as cardinal or Roman pontiff, if he has deviated from the Catholic faith or fallen into some kind of heresy, then it concludes, the promotion or elevation, even if it shall have been uncontested and accepted by the unanimous assent of all the cardinals, shall be null, void, and worthless. And later on in the document again refers to even if, the one elected has the obedience of all, he would not be the Pope, of course, if he deviated from the faith. Now, there are many, many errors, in interpreting this document and then concluding that if one who has been universally and peacefully accepted by the church is not the Pope. Rob, I'm going to point out one obvious problem right away, and then I'll let you fill in some details. Many, such as Ed Mazza, I think Brother Bugnolo and others, they come to mind. They basically say that, well, you guys are pushing universal and peaceful acceptance as some kind of doctrine in the church, but Cum Ex overrules UPA, proving that UPA is only a mere theological opinion, because look, Cum Ex says even if all of the cardinals are unanimous, right? Even if all of the cardinals assent to this man, a heretic cannot be Pope. Now, the first problem I see with that is that the doctrine, the definition of universal and peaceful acceptance does not say that if the cardinals alone are unanimous, that assures infallibly the legitimacy of the Pope, but rather the moment the entire church accepts the man as Pope, do we have the infallible certitude that he is in fact the Pope. Rob, you can fill in the blanks on that particular issue.
Well, the first point I would make is that Cum Ex is no longer in force. It's rendered, it's derogated, so it's no longer on the books. And that's what I've got on the screen right here. This is from Coronado's canon law.
It's in fact abrogated completely because the 17 code replaced all of this legislation.
Right. So if you look at footnote number 4 right here on the screen, it says, the Constitution of Paul VI, Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio of February 15, 1559, is no longer in force. Okay. Bishop Sanborn admits the same. So Bishop Sanborn says, the question is, does not Cum Ex of Paul IV contradict the thesis, his thesis? Cum Ex Apostolatus is an apostolic constitution, a law made by Paul IV, which says that if a pope should be a heretic, his elevation to the dignity would be null. It was made in order to ensure that no Protestant could ever become the pope. It does not apply, Sanborn says, for the present case for 2 reasons. The first is that it's no longer the law. It was derogated, made obsolete by the 1917 Code of Canon Law. There you go. So he admits the same. So it's no longer, it's off the books, no longer enforced. But you bring
And
up
that's
another
Sanborn you're quoting, right?
Bishop Sanborn.
And
So
I
another,
think, yeah, he says derogated. I would say he's wrong. It's abrogated. Derogation means, the partial law remains in effect. This whole thing is rendered null and void by the 17 code. So he doesn't get legal terminology correct, but I agree with him in substance. It doesn't apply anymore. So that,
okay, we had a technical difficulty there. So you had raised the question whether or not cum ex contradicts UPA, whether or not cum ex says the entire church can receive a pope who's actually a false pope. The answer, of course, is going to be no. But this was directly addressed by a canonist of the 18th century, 1737. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "You asked thirdly, whether the Constitution 19 of Paul VI, cum ex apostolatus, should be understood to mean that after the Pope has been received by the universal church, if he is later found to have been a heretic and schismatic, his election is null and void. I respond in the negative, because the church cannot err in receiving the Pope, who is the infallible rule of faith. Otherwise, she would not be the pillar and foundation of truth, against which the gates of hell will not prevail. Also because if the Pope, meaning Paul IV, had meant for the Constitution to speak of a Pope who had already been accepted by the whole church, it would necessarily follow that a Pope elected and so received could be such a one who, it would seem, did not have the assistance of the Holy Spirit, and hence was fallible in doing what he did, and that the church erred in following him, and had to prove that the Pope was false, from which it would follow that the existence of the papacy in the church is fallible and uncertain. But this is very absurd and injurious to the infallibility of the church. Therefore, this interpretation must be avoided." Now, if we skip down, he directly addresses the received by all, obedience of all. So let's see what he says there about that. He says, "Neither does it stand that the Constitution says, nor by the assumption of office, consecration, or subsequent possession of government and administration, or the quasi-enthronement of the Roman pontiff, or by the veneration or obedience rendered to him by all." And what he's saying there is that that doesn't contradict what he just said. He explains here below. "I say it does not stand because the participle all, omnibus, does not refer to the whole church, but to the whole college of cardinals, or to those present in Rome. For if the supreme pontiff Paul IV had meant to denote the whole church by the use of this participle, he would have expressed it more clearly as it truly should have been expressed. Moreover, it's not probable that the pontiff would have wished to render this article doubtful, namely, the article concerning the infallibility of the church in receiving the Pope, or indeed the assistance of the Holy Spirit to him who, without being contradicted by the church, acts as Pope by determining matters of faith and religion ex cathedra, on which the church's certitude of faith depends, and who has as her infallible rule of faith the Roman pontiff. Therefore, all omnibus is not to be understood as denoting the universal church. Moreover, although the name omnis, all, can have a strict or broad signification, yet if it is understood in the broad sense in this penal law, which was made to fight against heresy, it would not be favorable for the church. It could lead to the destruction of the faith and the faithful, and is an evident danger of schism and heresy itself, unless it is understood in the narrow sense as referring to the college of cardinals. Therefore, as understood as meaning that by the consent of all the cardinals, the aforementioned election does not become valid over the course of time. So there's the answer. UPA does not contradict, or cum ex does not contradict UPA. All refers to all the cardinals, not the entire church.
and this is consistent with what we presented on our last podcast, because even though one would expect that when the cardinals are unanimous, and they do represent the church then, beginning with the rest of the college of bishops, will receive, and then the church follows. Remember what we said in the last podcast: the cardinals electing and the Pope accepting, and then presenting that election and acceptance to the church is similar to, as John of St. Thomas and others have said, similar to the church proposing a definition of faith, but that definition of faith is not infallible yet until it's confirmed by the Pope in the context of a definition. Here, the theologians say, confirmed by the rest of the church, the entire church. And that's why when you read Cum Ex in light of, the magisterial teaching and theology of the church, of course, it doesn't, it's not limited, UPA is not limited to the cardinals proposing this man as the rule of faith, but the entire church then accepting the man as the rule of faith. The moment, as we said in the last podcast, that the entire church accepts him, he's Pope. So that's totally consistent, Rob, with how we presented this last time. Another thing just came to mind, the fact that this is legislation, albeit it's the highest form of legislation. If you think technically about it, legislation can't supersede a definition of the faith. And Martin V had already, effectively had made the acceptance of a Pope de Fide in 1418. So Paul IV isn't coming along, 150 years later and saying, I'm overruling Martin V's definition in Inter Cunctas in 1559. It just doesn't make sense. And that just proves that we're dealing with separate issues. UPA is separate and distinct from what Cum Ex was trying to accomplish here.
I would also add that just as the Pope is a subject of infallibility, so too is the entire College of Bishops a subject of infallibility, meaning infallibility dwells in the entire subject. And the legitimacy of a Pope is an object of that infallibility. That's why the entire college can't accept a false Pope as a true Pope, because they possess infallibility collectively, and the legitimacy of a Pope is an object of that infallibility. If they all accept a Pope as a true Pope, it's infallibly certain he's a true Pope because they're a subject of infallibility. During Vatican I, the question was not whether the entire college was a subject of infallibility. Everyone admitted that. The question was, is the Pope a separate subject of infallibility? That's what the Gallicans denied. That's why in the definition of papal infallibility, so the Gallicans said that if a Pope defines a doctrine ex cathedra, it's only considered infallible or irreformable if the entire college accepts it, because they believed only the entire college was a subject of infallibility.
Right.
Infallibility only dwelt in the entire college, not in the Pope alone. Well, what Vatican I defined is called separate infallibility. That means that, yes, the entire college possesses it, but the Pope has it singularly, separately. And so that's why in the definition of infallibility, at the very end, it says his definitions are irreformable without the consent of the church. See, without the consent of the entire college. That's what that's referring. It's referring to the Gallican error that said no, requires the consent. So that's why UPA is infallible, because the entire college is a subject of infallibility, and the object, the legitimate Pope, is an object of that infallibility. That's the theology behind that.
Yeah. And also you mentioned that the Pope has infallibility singularly, and that's because Christ gave Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven individually and the authority to bind and loose. When we talk about the collective infallibility of the college, they're sharing in the power of the keys, but Peter alone holds these keys in a sense. Is how we look at that. I thought about our new Holy Father Leo the 14th, and it was just beautiful when he came out, on the balcone, and he was immediately accepted. Right now, when was the moment? Well, the entire church embraced him at that point, but then, you hear all the other cardinals coming out. You find out that this man was elected with over 100 votes out of 133. The entire College of Bishops embraced him. Then the Universal Church embraced him. So as we talked about in our podcast last time, that universal and peaceful acceptance is going to be made very evident, as soon as that Pope is presented to the church. It was a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and we have no local ordinaries, no bishops of particular churches who have come out and said he's not the Pope. So the entire hierarchy has accepted him as Pope. You have some Sedevacantist heretics who don't accept him, but they were already setting it up to not accept him.
Sure.
Their vote doesn't count, so to speak. They're outside the church. The entire teaching church accepts him as Pope, and the teaching church, the Ecclesiadocians, is a subject of infallibility.
Right. Right.
Yeah, not the laity. Laity have indirect infallibility when they accept what the teaching church teaches, but the teaching church is a subject of the infallibility, and none of the bishops have come out and rejected him as Pope.
No, it's just the enemies of the church of our day. I've heard a number of sermons of Sedevacantist bishops. You have the Mario Dirksons and the Louis Verrecchios out there. What is their argument, Rob? Their argument was he's not a Catholic.
Oh my
He's
God.
part of the Novus Ordo religion. He's part of the Vatican II religion. That's the depth of their theological analysis. He's not a Catholic. Well, wait a minute. The Roman Catholic Church accepts him as a Catholic. They accept him as the profession of faith, and therefore he is a Catholic. What church are you guys referring to? You're certainly not referring to the Roman Catholic Church.
Right. The Catholic Church accepts him as a Catholic. It accepts him as one who professes the true faith. Doesn't matter what Mario Dirksen or Brother Bugnolo think.
Right.
And now what makes someone a Catholic or not a Catholic? According to Father Altman used the same argument. He said, just as a Baptist can't be the Pope or a Lutheran can't be the Pope, so too Francis can't be the Pope because he's not a Catholic, right?
Yeah.
And then Father Altman gives 20 proofs that Francis is not a Catholic, okay? And he said each one of these proofs in and of themselves prove he's not a Catholic, he's a manifest heretic and couldn't be Pope. What are some of those proofs? Ready for these? Taking a picture of Bill Clinton. Taking a picture of Bill Clinton proves he's not a Catholic. Remember when Francis was walking along, shaking everyone's hand, and he turned away, and that one lady grabbed his hand and pulled him back?
Yeah.
And got frustrated and slapped her hand? That's another proof Father Alton brings forward to prove Francis wasn't a Catholic. So, I mean, it's unbelievable.
It just shows how they're operating solely on the emotional level, not the theological magisterial level. It's horrible. What's diabolical, I say, ultimately, it truly is diabolical.
Yeah, you wonder how someone like Father Alton made it through the first year of seminary with that type of thinking,
Yeah. What other errors? I mean, there's so many errors. The other thing that comes to mind is, well, we can even back up and say, Paul IV, it's understood that he enacted this legislation to prevent Cardinal Moroni from being elected because he was notoriously heretical. He was a member of the Humanist Party. He had revolutionary ideas. I mean, I think that has been established in the external forum as his motivation behind this. Mm-hmm. But remember, and we cite in our book True or False Pope, and we prove this, that cum ex concerned pre-election heresy,
right?
Not post-election heresy. And I bring up Cardinal Moroni for that purpose, but and so that's another thing. These Sedevacantists have said, well, look what Francis has done. He has fallen from his pontificate, and therefore cum ex says that even if he was accepted in the beginning, the fact that he now has signed Amoris Laetitia and Fiducia Supplicans, he's lost the pontificate. Well, that doesn't even apply. It's not even on point with the legislation of this now repealed document. But we also prove in our book that the pre-election heresy that Paul IV had in mind had to be legally recognized by the church. It had to be established in the external forum, either through an admission of heresy before a tribunal, or you were censured for heresy and excommunicated. So, cum ex was, effectively a retroactive penalty imposed upon those who are elevated, to a see, even the papacy, but who were previously judged heretics by the church. And in our book, we cite two canonists from the time that this bull was issued. Canonists, I have Marcus Borgesius and Antonio Massa. And again, even Bishop Sandmore, the pseudo-bishop of the Sedevacantist sect, he also admits this. Cum ex was not, dealing with post-election heresy, but really pre-election heresy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Another point is that, so what cum ex says is if anyone can be shown to have deviated from the faith prior to his elevation, it's null and void. Okay. It doesn't say if he deviated, then converted, just deviated. Well, how about Cardinal Manning and Cardinal Manning? They were both heretics, yet they were promoted to bishop and then cardinal in the Catholic Church after they converted.
That's a great point. We mentioned Cardinal Manning. I mean, the pseudo-bishop of the Anglican sect. Yeah. He was a notorious heretic because he was a public non-Catholic, which is what a notorious heretic is. So how could he have been raised, to the episcopate? Same with Cardinal Newman. He couldn't have been elevated the episcopacy to a cardinal. They were all notorious heretics prior to their appointments.
What was happening at the time of cum ex, people may not know, is this is explained by Pius V in Intra Multiplicis, where he renewed this constitution of Paul IV. What was happening is you had a problem in which those who have been denounced of heresy and then investigated by the Inquisition had brought forth false witnesses and used other illegitimate, illegal, false means to exonerate themselves. Okay, so they were exonerated of heresy. Not only that, but they were getting decrees of silence, which prohibited them from being investigated from new details that emerged and referred their case directly to the Pope. So they were basically free from the accusation of heresy, but yet they continued to spread their same heresies and were deceiving a lot of the faithful. So there's illegal things taking place that were exonerating heretics who then continue to spread their heresies under the pretext of being exonerated and were deceiving the faithful. That's the context of this. That's what was taking place when Cum Ex was issued. And you can read that in Inter Multiplicis of Pius V, which was December 21st of 1605, I believe, 1605, 1606. You can find it online, part of it online.
And again, we're dealing with legislation here. Of course, legislation can't repeal or overrule de fide teachings, like definition of Martin V. Another thing that comes to mind is these Sedevacantists. Father Cicada was notorious for this. They're saying, well, Cum Ex is not just legislative. It actually concerns the divine law. This is what they say. And they say, because the sin of heresy concerns the matter of divine law, and we know the sin of heresy causes the loss of office, Cum Ex is in force in perpetuity because it concerns the divine law. Now, of course, as we have proven over and over again for how many years now, the sin of heresy never causes the loss of office or jurisdiction. It never impedes one from receiving jurisdiction. Even you would hope even Sedevacantists would admit that occult heretics who are guilty of the mortal sin of heresy and have severed themselves from the soul of the church would still hold their office in the church. So again, this appeal to divine law, which is almost a catch-all tactic of the Sedevacantists, as long as they can umbrella it under divine law, they can overlook all of the technical arguments that they can't engage with. It's absurd. It's not divine law. Any comments on that, Rob?
Yeah, here's what happens. They'll read Father Cicada's argument that heresy as a violation of divine law causes the loss of office or prevents one from being elected pope. Okay. Based on that, they will believe that if a pope commits the sin of heresy, he's ipso facto deposed. Okay. This is how Mario Dirksen fell into the Sedevacantist heresy. Okay. Yep. And based on that belief that the sin of heresy causes loss of office, they will then judge the Pope's actions. And if they personally conclude he's guilty of the sin of heresy, that judgment, he's guilty of the sin, is at the same time the judgment he's not the Pope.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what, doesn't have to come out and deny a dogma. He can just do something like taking a picture of Bill Clinton. They can conclude only a heretic would do that. See, that's it. That's the problem. They think that committing the sin of heresy, like Father Cicada said, even for a moment, doesn't require warning. Even for a moment, he ceases to be Pope. So they then judge, and of course, all they're hearing is bad things about the Pope. Everything's being spun in the worst light. So they're reading all these headlines, and they judge. There's no way he has the faith. You see, there's no way he has the virtue of faith based on what he's doing in their mind. Therefore, if he doesn't have the virtue of faith, he committed the sin of heresy, he's not the Pope. Sure. That's the way 99% of these heretics have arrived at their position.
Right.
The sin of heresy causes loss of office. They then judge he's committed the sin. They think he's not the Pope. Absolutely.
Yeah. And the sin of heresy concerns the internal forum. And they've never, for all these years, never properly equate committing the sin of heresy with the judgment of God. Because when you read the theologians and even the Pope Innocents, for example, saying, I can lose my office and be judged by the church because I am already judged. Well, they conclude that already judgment is a private judgment that I can make to conclude that because he's lost the faith, he's lost the office, and the church is simply confirming that he's lost the office. Yeah. No, time out. He's already been judged by God. Right. In the internal form. He's severed himself from the soul of the church by having committed the sin of heresy. Yeah. And therefore, the church can judge whether he's in the external form guilty of the crime of heresy. It is the crime then that separates him from jurisdiction, from office, from
Right.
hierarchical communion.
And the church is not judging if he already lost his office. It's judging if he's guilty of the crime of heresy. Like Bellarmine says, he has to be convicted of heresy before
Right.
he sees to go. What Bellarmine says is that an occult heretic is someone who has committed the mortal sin of heresy, but has not separated from the external structure of the church. He still professes to be a Catholic. He still goes to mass. He hasn't left the church. He said in that case, someone who's guilty of the mortal sin of heresy, one of two things has to happen before he ceases to be pope, before he loses his title, his jurisdiction, and his dignity as pope. What are those two things? Either he leaves the church on his own, separates himself from the church, joins a non-Catholic sect, or what's the other thing? He's convicted of heresy. He's convicted of heresy, then he ceases to be pope. Council doesn't get together to find out if he already lost his office.
Right.
It gets together to see if he's guilty of heresy. If so, it convicts him, he ceases to be pope at that point.
And we'll refer people to our website and the very extensive article we have on St. Robert Bellarmine and the true teaching of Bellarmine. Again, we encourage our viewers to read that article because that actually presents what Bellarmine meant by ipso facto loss of office. And this has been consistent before Bellarmine and after Bellarmine. This is what Pius XII meant in Mystici Corporis when he says either openly leaves or is cut off by the church's judgment.
Right. Another point is that cut off by the church, he means excommunication, but actually if you read the theologians such as Ludwig van Ott in the 400 section of his book, Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, he says what Pius XII is referring to there is not just excommunication, it's excommunication vitandus, because there's excommunication vitandus, which means they have to be avoided by Catholics, and there's excommunication toleratus. He says that's referring to excommunication vitandus, but actually vitandus excommunication is no longer on the books. It's
Right.
all excommunication toleratus. That would mean that someone who is excommunicated is actually still a member of the church. He's cut off from the sacraments, but
Right.
he didn't cease to be a member of the church. And that's consistent with what the theologians teach. So
Yes.
really that second part doesn't even apply. What applies, you profess, you're received into the church and you leave the church, you cease to be a Catholic. You leave the church like Mario Dirksen did. You leave
Right.
the church like all the Sedevacantists did. Then you cease to be a Catholic when you join a non-Catholic sect.
Absolutely right. It's all consistent. Another argument that I see them bring up, and we did mention this in our book, it's bizarre because they appeal to this repealed legislation, and then they say, look, cum ex, repealed legislation, is actually referenced in another repealed legislation, canon 188.4 of the 17 code. Again, that's repealed by the 83 code, so why do they continue to refer to legislation that no longer exists? But that proves absolutely nothing. Now they'll say that to say, you see, this enduring quality of cum ex is in the 17 code, meaning again it's part of the divine law. Not at all. I mean, we've pointed out that in canon law, first of all, it's just a footnote in 188.4, and footnotes are not authoritative. They usually are part of the canons because they're just giving legislative history. Things that might be related to or relevant to the canon. But again, 188.4 regards post-election defection. It regards losing your office after you have already assumed the office. Whereas cum ex is saying you've never assumed the office because the pre-election, the notorious heresy pre-election, prevented you from obtaining the office. So again, it's just another example of them appealing to nonsensical authorities.
Here's something else I haven't mentioned to you. I dug into this a little bit, and where is cum ex referenced in relation to canon 188.4? It's not referenced in the official canon law promulgated by Benedict XV. It's referenced in commentaries.
Yes.
Commentaries. So it references it. That's not the official church.
Right.
Officially, it's commentaries referencing it. Not all of them either.
And I was just going to say, and not all of them.
Right. The church itself did not reference that when it promulgated the code. Just canons referenced it.
And that's because it's really not on point.
It's not on point. It's apples and oranges, actually.
It is in terms of the loss of office.
Yeah, it just relates in some way. Not,
Yep. I mean, just another point, a few more, I guess. There are some crazies out there that even say it's infallible. I mean, it's absurd. We saw Pope Michael, the Michael Baldwin, say that. Richard E. Brani. We've refuted that in our book. We've shown authors. We cite Dr. Hergenrother in his 1876 book disproves this. Joseph Fessler, the Secretary of Vatican I, refutes that. There are a number of things we can say about that. But this document, Rob, wasn't it really unearthed and resurrected by the heretics around Vatican I to attack papal infallibility, right? I mean, von Dollinger, Joseph von Dollinger, and I think his book was called The Pope and the Council. I mean, this is what he based his attack on papal infallibility. He says, look at how poorly drafted Cum Exis, look at how tyrannical its provisions are. And this was issued as a de fide definition, but it can't possibly be because of the poor drafting. That's what he said. That was his argument.
They used it to prove infallibility is false.
Right.
Yeah, but it wasn't. It's how did the Catholic theologians respond to that? Did they say, no, it isn't infallible? No, they said, no, it wasn't infallible. They didn't try to defend the legislation because they kind of conceded it's problematic. They said it wasn't infallible. That's how they responded to it.
100%. Yep. And of course, these people became the old Catholics that were excommunicated by Blessed Pius IX.
And who ordained the first Sedevacantist of priest and consecrated a bishop the very next day? An old Catholic bishop.
Yeah, from the CMRI sect, the sect that Mario Dirksen left the Catholic Church for.
That's right. That was
the first bishop. Yeah, Francis Schuchart.
Yeah,
he became anti-pope Adrian the Seventh.
Yeah, and that's the founder of Mario Dirksen's sect.
Yep. So Dirksen, yeah.
Mario Dirksen, he's left the church. I mean, I feel sorry for Mario. He's actually the only Sedevacantist apologist that I think will convert. The apologists never convert. Your average Sedevacantist don't convert. The apologists never convert. My impression, I don't know Mario. My impression is actually probably a good guy who means well. Just was deceived by Father Scott. I think there's a chance he will convert. And
I hope so.
We'll see if that happens. The other one, there's a chance, but him, I think there's a chance that he'll convert. But we'll see.
He's welcome on our podcast.
Now, one problem with him is that he's embraced so many Sedevacantist errors. He is unable to believe the Catholic Church is still the true church. He's embraced errors that logically cause him to conclude it's not. Well, we'll be addressing those errors he's embraced and clearing them up. So that kind of paves the way for him to re-enter the church in these podcasts.
Sure hope so.
Yeah.
There's one last thing I want to mention. I see Ed Mazza out there, who not only does not understand the theology, but he falsifies history. He points to the Great Western Schism in an effort to, attempt to disprove, if you will, the de fide teaching of universal and peaceful acceptance. And what he has publicly stated is that, after Urban VI was elected, we know that a segment of cardinals broke off then to elect Clement the Seventh, and that's actually what caused the Great Western Schism. Mm-hmm. Mazza's out there saying that Clement was universally and peacefully accepted. Well, if that's the case, how could there possibly have been a schism? But he falsifies history, Rob, because he actually claims that all of the cardinals accepted Clement, which is not true. You don't have to do a lot of research to say that. I think it was only 11 out of the 29 cardinals ended up electing adhering to Clement. So he falsifies history. The rest of the cardinals continued to adhere to Urban VI, as did St. Catherine of Siena, my great, Dominican Holy Mother in the faith. So, Clement VII is what triggered the schism. But again, people like Mazza are out there trying to falsify history, hoping that people actually don't look into it to say, well, this is just a theological opinion, and history proves that that's only what it is, because here's a fact pattern that disproves it. Yeah.
They bring up two historical examples. The worst possible historical examples you can imagine. One of them is Innocent II and Anacletus II. And Barnhart brings this up. So what happened here is that Innocent II, the true pope, was elected in the morning by a faction of cardinals, and it was actually legitimate. It was kind of underhanded, but they had the right cardinals, the right number, and the right ones to elect a pope. They elected Innocent II. Later that afternoon, another faction of cardinals elected Anacletus II. Okay, so she says Anacletus II was universally accepted. He was never universally accepted.
Never.
No,
but they have to argue that, Rob, in order to maintain their current Sedevacantist position, because they know that the entire Roman Catholic Church has accepted them. Now they've rejected the church, and that's how they, I guess, sustain their incredulous position.
That's it. Now think about the case of the Great Western Schism. Urban VI was the first pope elected, And then the cardinals kind of regretted their choice. They weren't happy with how he was governed the church. So they
Right.
elected another pope, Clement the 12th. Okay. Now, if he was universally accepted, that would then mean that no one would elect a successor to Urban the Sixth when he died. Right.
Right.
There
Right.
would be no Western Schism, but they did elect a successor.
But they did. That's right.
Yeah, it's just so absurd. These examples they bring up is so absurd, but they're hoping no one looks into it. It only takes 5 minutes to search on the Catholic Encyclopedia or anywhere else. You'll see that neither one of those were universally accepted by the entire church.
That's
And
why there was a great Western Schism.
yeah, exactly. That was what caused the Western Schism. Is the election of Clement the 12th. Now you have two popes, two lines of popes. You didn't have, if the whole church would have accepted him, there would have been no schism, right?
No
It would have
question
ended.
about it.
It wouldn't have been a schism at all. So anyway, so the Great Western Schism was 38 years
Yeah.
in which there were multiple papal claimants, and the hierarchy itself was divided between who was the true pope, and it was so difficult to figure out. They weren't quite sure. It was almost impossible to know who the true pope was. Actually,
Right.
though, think about it. If they would have adhered to the peaceful universal acceptance, they would have known Urban VI was the true pope because he was accepted by the whole church at first.
That's right. I think it was a matter of like 6 months when they started saying they
Yeah.
didn't like how this guy was governing the church, and they broke off and elected Clement.
So that would have prevented the Great Western Schism. They would have just adhered to that doctrine, which was taught before that time. By the way, they just didn't adhere to it.
These are good points, and it's such a consoling doctrine, right? Because we know that when our new Holy Father, Pope Leo XIV, walked out and was embraced by the church, and we then learned, the consensus that the cardinals had, that all the bishop have accepted. And as you said, there's not a single bishop that's come out and says, "Hey, there was a problem here."
Right.
It's over at that point. We have infallible certitude as a matter of faith, that this man is the true pope.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It sure seems like this was the Holy Ghost's choice. When you hear how the election took place, that there was a bunch of factions, there was factions on the right, factions on the left, even factions in the center, but this pope was not one of the choices of any of those factions. Yet he became pope in just 4 elections. The cardinals united behind him. It seems, from what I've heard, this was definitely the pope the Holy Ghost wanted to be elected. We'll see how it turns out, but
It does appear that way.
So far, I think he's gonna be a good pope.
Yeah. Pray for him every day. Well, that's great. I hope that this presentation answered your questions on this appealing to cum ex apostolatus. I hope we put that in a proper context for everyone. Again, we welcome your suggestion for future podcasts, and we'll see you the next time.
Okay, bye-bye.